For over 5,000 years, empires have fought, prophets have preached, and armies have bled over this one strip of land. Gaza, a place smaller than most cities, yet larger than life in the pages of history. Why has Gaza always been at the heart of the world's greatest struggles? And why, even today, does it remain one of the most contested places on earth? From the outset, we need to understand one thing. Gaza is not just a modern conflict zone. It is one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on the planet. Archaeological digs reveal human presence in Gaza as early as the 15th century BCE. Its very position, on the edge of the Mediterranean Sea, at the crossroads between Africa and Asia, destined it to become a prize worth fighting for. Imagine a map. To the southwest lies Egypt, cradle of the pharaohs. To the north, the Levant, gateway to Mesopotamia. Gaza sits directly between them. Whoever controlled Gaza could dominate trade, armies, and ideas flowing across continents. For thousands of years, this thin coastal corridor has been less than 40 kilometers long, but it has held the weight of empires. From the Egyptians to the Philistines, the Persians, Greeks, Romans, Crusaders, Ottomans, and the powers of today, Gaza has always been a chessboard square where history's greatest players make their move. In this documentary, we will trace Gaza's story, from the ancient world to 2023, a story of resilience, devastation, faith, and survival. Our journey begins in the Bronze Age. By the 2nd millennium BCE, Gaza was already a thriving Canaanite settlement. Its fertile soil and access to trade routes made it invaluable. The ancient Egyptians, always eager to secure their northeastern frontier, quickly took notice. Records from the reign of Pharaoh Thutmose III in the 15th century BCE describe Gaza as a strategic garrison town. To the Egyptians, Gaza was the first city of Asia. Whoever controlled it had a gateway into the Levant and beyond. But Gaza was not just military. It was commercial. Caravans passed through carrying copper, incense, spices, and grain. Ships sailed from its harbors into the Mediterranean. Even in these early centuries, Gaza was not isolated. It was plugged into the arteries of global trade. Around the 12th century BCE, new players appeared on the coast of Canaan. A seafaring people known as the Philistines settled 5 cities: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. Together, they formed what we call the Philistine Pentapolis. And Gaza was their crown jewel. The Philistines brought with them advanced technologies of ironworking and new forms of pottery. They quickly became formidable opponents to the neighboring Israelites. The Hebrew Bible itself frequently mentions Gaza. In the book of Judges, we read of the mighty Samson tearing down the gates of Gaza. Later, the prophets denounce Gaza as a stronghold of Israel's enemies. Whether one views these accounts through the lens of faith or archaeology, they testify to Gaza's importance. It was seen as a fortress, a place that determined the balance of power in the region. By the 8th century BCE, the great empires of Mesopotamia looked westward. Assyrian kings like Tiglath-Pileser III and Sargon II conquered vast stretches of the Levant. Gaza once again became a target. Assyrian inscriptions tell us that Gaza rebelled more than once, seeking independence. But each time it was crushed. Its leaders were deported, its people forced into the imperial system. Later, the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar II marched into Gaza. Like Jerusalem, Gaza suffered devastation. Yet it endured, because for empires, Gaza was too valuable to abandon. By the 6th century BCE, the Persians absorbed Gaza into their empire. Under the Achaemenids, Gaza became part of the satrapy of beyond the river. The Persians recognized its strategic and economic importance. The Greek historian Herodotus even mentions Gaza as a key station along the Persian royal road. Merchants and armies alike passed through, moving between Asia and Africa. Already, Gaza's identity was shaped by a cycle: conquest, destruction, and renewal. Each empire left its mark. Yet the city persisted, adapting, absorbing, surviving. The most dramatic episode of Gaza's ancient history came in 332 BCE. Alexander the Great, having defeated the Persians, marched down the Levantine coast. His mission: secure every city before invading Egypt. Most towns surrendered quickly, but Gaza resisted. According to Arrian and Diodorus Siculus, Gaza was a fortified city with high walls and a determined garrison led by a Persian commander named Battus. For 2 months, Alexander laid siege. Siege towers were rolled in. Battering rams pounded the walls. Yet the defenders fought fiercely. Finally, Alexander's forces breached the city. What followed was brutal. Gaza was stormed, its men slaughtered, women and children enslaved. Battus, the commander, was captured. In a chilling act meant to echo Achilles' treatment of Hector in the Iliad, Alexander tied Battus by his heels to a chariot and dragged him to death. This moment burned Gaza into the annals of Greek history. The city was rebuilt as a Hellenistic settlement, with Greek culture mixing into the local traditions. But the blood spilled here was remembered. After Alexander's death, his generals carved up the empire. Gaza fell into the hands of the Ptolemies of Egypt, then later the Seleucids of Syria. In this period, Gaza became known for its cosmopolitan character. Greek temples stood alongside Semitic shrines. Coins minted in Gaza bore the images of Zeus, Athena, and other Hellenistic gods. Yet Gaza also became a battleground between rival dynasties. Each time armies marched between Egypt and Syria, Gaza was caught in the middle. Its walls were battered again and again, and yet, the city survived. It always did. By the time the Romans entered the scene, Gaza was already a veteran of countless wars. Its streets had seen pharaohs, Assyrians, Persians, and Greeks. But under Rome, Gaza would reach new heights of prosperity. And it would also become a battlefield of the spirit, as the rise of Christianity clashed with pagan traditions. The story of Gaza was far from over. In fact, it was only beginning. By the 1st century BCE, the armies of Rome swept across the eastern Mediterranean. After the Roman general Pompey conquered the region in 63 BCE, Gaza became part of the Roman province of Judea, and later Syria-Palestina. Unlike the brutal sieges of earlier centuries, this transition marked a period of renewed prosperity for Gaza. Roman administrators recognized the city's potential as both a commercial hub and a cultural melting pot. Roman engineers rebuilt Gaza's infrastructure. Roads extended from Gaza to Jerusalem, Damascus, and the Egyptian frontier. Amphitheaters and public baths were constructed. Trade boomed. One of Gaza's most lucrative exports was wine. Ancient texts and archaeological finds confirm that Gaza wine, transported in distinctive amphorae, was shipped across the Mediterranean, reaching as far as Gaul and Spain. Roman villas from Europe have been uncovered with jars stamped, "Product of Gaza." For a time, Gaza was not a city of war. It was a city of wealth. Yet Gaza's cultural identity in the Roman period was unique. While many cities of the region gradually absorbed Hellenistic and Roman religious practices alongside Judaism and Christianity, Gaza became renowned as a bastion of paganism. Temples to Greek and Roman gods dotted the city. Zeus, Aphrodite, Apollo, all were worshipped in Gaza. For centuries, Gaza resisted the new monotheistic faith that began to sweep the empire: Christianity. Church historian Sozomen, himself a native of Gaza, wrote that his hometown was fiercely loyal to its ancient gods well into the 4th century CE, long after Christianity became the official religion of Rome. This stubborn devotion would set the stage for fierce religious conflict. By the 4th century CE, the Roman Empire had embraced Christianity under Emperor Constantine. Churches were erected across the Mediterranean. But Gaza remained an exception, a proud pagan holdout. Christian missionaries faced hostility. Pagan mobs reportedly attacked Christian converts. And local leaders resisted the building of churches. It was only in the late 4th and early 5th centuries that Christianity began to take firm root. Bishops such as Porphyry of Gaza played pivotal roles. According to Christian chronicles, Porphyry petitioned the Byzantine Empress Eudoxia, wife of Emperor Arcadius, to destroy Gaza's pagan temples. In 402 CE, imperial orders were given. With imperial troops present, the great temples of Gaza were torn down, replaced with churches. The Marnian, Gaza's grand temple to Zeus, was destroyed and a cathedral was built on its ruins. This moment symbolized a profound shift. Gaza, once a citadel of paganism, was forcibly Christianized. Under the Byzantine Empire, Gaza flourished as a Christian intellectual center. The city became famous for its schools of rhetoric and philosophy. Scholars from Gaza contributed to the theological debates that defined early Christianity. The city also became a pilgrimage site, given its association with biblical events and its churches. Monasteries dotted the surrounding deserts, as monks sought solitude in the wilderness. But the Byzantine Golden Age of Gaza would not last forever. By the 7th century, a new faith was rising in the Arabian Peninsula, one that would soon sweep across the Middle East and transform Gaza once again. In the 630s CE, Muslim armies under the leadership of Caliph Abu Bakr and later Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab began their campaigns into the Levant. The decisive Battle of Yarmouk in 636 CE shattered Byzantine power in Syria. One by one, cities fell under the banners of Islam. Gaza was no exception. By 637 CE, Gaza was incorporated into the rapidly expanding Rashidun Caliphate. Byzantine garrisons retreated, and Islamic governance took hold. This was not just a military conquest. It was a cultural and religious transformation. Mosques were constructed, churches remained but under new rules, and Gaza became integrated into the Islamic world. One of Gaza's most enduring contributions to Islamic history is its connection to Imam al-Shafi'i, one of the 4 great founders of Sunni Islamic jurisprudence. He was born in Gaza in 767 CE. His legal school, the Shafi'i Madhab, remains influential across the Muslim world to this day. This fact alone elevated Gaza's spiritual status in Islamic memory. Under the Umayyads and Abbasids, Gaza was both a frontier town and a trade city. Merchants carried goods from the Arabian Peninsula, Egypt, and the Levant. Pilgrims traveling to and from Mecca passed through Gaza's roads. But the city also endured hardship. The early centuries of Islamic rule were punctuated by earthquakes, famines, and political upheavals. Yet Gaza persisted scarred, but alive. For nearly 3 centuries, the Byzantine Empire and successive Muslim caliphates clashed along the eastern Mediterranean. Gaza, lying close to the frontier, was often caught in the turbulence. Armies marched past its gates. Fortifications were rebuilt, destroyed, and rebuilt again. Yet Gaza never vanished from the maps. Its location was too critical to ignore. By the 10th century, under the Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt, Gaza regained prosperity. It became a key provincial city, an administrative and military hub on the road between Cairo and Damascus. The city's mosques were expanded, markets thrived, and scholars continued to teach. Gaza once more balanced between suffering and resilience. But then, in the 11th century, a new wave of warriors came crashing into the Levant. Knights from Europe, wearing crosses on their chests and wielding steel swords, marched toward Jerusalem. And once again, Gaza would become a prize, this time in the bloody struggle between Crusaders and Muslims. The Crusades were about to transform Gaza into a fortress, a battlefield, and a symbol of holy war. The year is 1099 CE. Crusader armies from Europe stormed the Levant, capturing Jerusalem after a bloody siege. Their goal: secure the Holy Land for Christendom. But in order to hold Jerusalem, they needed the coastal road, and that road passed through Gaza. Initially, Gaza remained outside Crusader hands. But by 1100 CE, the Crusaders occupied the city. Recognizing its strategic importance, they turned Gaza into a fortified outpost of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The Crusaders constructed a massive castle known as Gaza Castle, or Qasr al-Basha. Built on older foundations, its thick stone walls dominated the city. From here, the Crusaders controlled the southern approach to Palestine. But Gaza was not simply a fortress. Crusader chronicles note its fertile fields and vineyards. The Crusaders exploited this, using Gaza to supply their garrisons deeper inland. Yet their grip was fragile. By the mid-12th century, Muslim resistance grew under the leadership of Nur al-Din in Syria, and later Saladin, one of history's most legendary commanders. In 1170 CE, Saladin's forces advanced into Gaza, challenging Crusader control. For decades, Gaza seesawed between the Franks and the Muslims. Each conquest left scars: burned crops, destroyed homes, rebuilt walls. Finally, in 1187 CE, after Saladin's decisive victory at the Battle of Hattin, Muslim forces swept through the region. Jerusalem fell, and Gaza returned to Islamic rule under the Ayyubid dynasty. The Crusader castle was repurposed. Mosques were restored. Gaza's identity as part of the Islamic world was reaffirmed. But the story was not finished. The Crusaders launched repeated campaigns to retake the Holy Land. Gaza, lying on the main invasion routes, suffered repeated clashes. Armies marched in, marched out. Each time, the people endured destruction and rebuilding. During Ayyubid rule, Gaza regained importance as a provincial hub on the Cairo-Damascus road. Caravans carrying spices, silks, and other luxuries passed through. But Gaza was also a military frontier. Fortresses were reinforced, troops stationed, watchtowers built. The memory of Crusader incursions was fresh. One interesting note: Arab geographers of the 12th and 13th centuries described Gaza as a city of lush orchards and fertile lands. Despite the wars, its natural wealth made it worth fighting for again and again. Still, the cycle of siege and recovery had taken its toll. Gaza's population shrank, and much of its ancient grandeur was lost. By the 13th century, a new power rose in Egypt: the Mamluks. Originally slave soldiers, the Mamluks seized power and built a powerful sultanate centered in Cairo. When they defeated the last Crusaders in the late 1200s, Gaza fell firmly under Mamluk control. For the first time in centuries, the city was no longer on the front line of Christian-Muslim wars. And under the Mamluks, Gaza experienced a revival. The Mamluks recognized Gaza's importance and designated it the capital of a district that stretched along the southern Levant. Governors were stationed in the city, and administrative buildings were constructed. Travelers of the time described Gaza as lively and prosperous once more. Markets bustled. Caravans stopped to restock. Scholars and jurists taught in its mosques. The famous historian Al-Makrizi recorded Gaza as a thriving town, producing grains, fruits, and textiles. The city's Friday mosque was expanded, and new religious schools, madrasas, were founded. One of the Mamluks' most significant contributions was re-establishing Gaza as a hub on the Red Sea-Mediterranean trade network. Goods from India and Arabia came through the Red Sea to Egypt, then traveled by land through Gaza toward Syria and beyond. Merchants passing through described Gaza as a safe and bustling stopover. Caravans carried pepper, sugar, glassware, and silks. Gaza's economy thrived. For nearly 2 centuries, under the stability of Mamluk rule, Gaza enjoyed peace relative to its stormy past. The Mamluks also invested in Gaza's spiritual life. Mosques were rebuilt or expanded, Sufi lodges, zawiyas were established, and shrines maintained. Gaza's association with figures like Imam al-Shafi'i gave it special status among Islamic scholars. The city became a center of learning and piety, drawing students and clerics from across the region. But this renaissance would not last forever. For looming on the horizon was yet another empire, one that would dominate Gaza for centuries: the Ottomans. In 1516, the Ottoman Turks marched south, defeating the Mamluks at the Battle of Marj Dabik. Soon, Gaza would find itself absorbed into one of the largest empires the world had ever seen. Under Ottoman rule, Gaza would experience centuries of relative obscurity, punctuated by moments of revival and turmoil. And once again, this small strip of land would prove that even in the shadows of empires, its story was never truly forgotten. The year is 1516 CE. The Ottoman Turks, led by Sultan Selim I, crushed the Mamluks at the Battle of Marj Dabik in Syria. Soon after, Gaza, along with all of Palestine, is absorbed into the expanding Ottoman Empire. For Gaza, this marks the beginning of 4 centuries under Ottoman rule. At first, the city retained its importance as a district capital. The Ottomans reorganized their new provinces, and Gaza became the seat of a sanjak, an administrative district within the larger province of Damascus. But unlike in the Mamluk period, Gaza's role began to shift. Though still a waypoint on the Cairo to Damascus road, the city gradually declined in regional prominence. Larger ports like Acre and Jaffa drew more trade. Gaza remained important, but often overshadowed. So, what was life like in Gaza under the Ottomans? Historical records and travelers' accounts describe a small but steady town, with fertile fields producing wheat, barley, olives, and fruits. The surrounding countryside supported herding and agriculture, while the city's markets traded in regional goods. Architectural traces from this period still survive. Mosques were maintained and expanded, caravanserais, roadside inns, welcomed merchants, and Ottoman-style houses were built. Yet Gaza was far from a bustling metropolis. In fact, many historians describe it as a provincial backwater, a town with history in its bones, but little political power compared to the great cities of the empire. Even so, Gaza retained strategic significance. Sitting at the threshold of Sinai, it served as a military garrison on the frontier with Egypt. Ottoman armies often passed through Gaza on their way to campaigns further south. This military importance meant that while Gaza may have been quiet, it was never irrelevant. As the centuries passed, Gaza experienced cycles of prosperity and decline. In the 17th century, local governors from powerful Arab families, such as the Ridwan dynasty, held sway over Gaza and its district. They turned the city into a regional power center once more. Gaza under the Ridwans was described by travelers as lively, prosperous, and well-guarded. But after the Ridwan family lost control in the late 17th century, Gaza slipped back into obscurity. Corruption, heavy taxation, and political instability sapped its strength. By the 18th century, Gaza was reduced largely to an agricultural town, its population diminished. Then, in 1799, Gaza suddenly re-entered global headlines. During his Egyptian campaign, Napoleon Bonaparte led his French army across Sinai and into Palestine. Gaza became a key stop on his march north toward Jaffa and Acre. Napoleon entered Gaza in February 1799. For a brief moment, this quiet provincial town found itself at the center of one of Europe's greatest military adventures. French soldiers camped in its streets, and Napoleon himself stayed in what locals called Qasr al-Basha, the old Crusader castle still standing centuries later. From Gaza, Napoleon issued proclamations promising liberation from Ottoman rule and appealing to both Muslims and Jews. But his stay was short. After his failed siege of Acre, Napoleon retreated through Gaza back into Egypt. Though his presence was fleeting, Napoleon's march through Gaza symbolized something larger: the creeping intrusion of European powers into Ottoman-controlled lands. A new age of colonial rivalry was dawning. By the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was weakening. European powers, Britain, France, and later Germany, expanded their influence in the Middle East through trade, diplomacy, and military pressure. For Gaza, this century was one of hardship and modest revival. Travelers described Gaza as a walled town with narrow streets, markets, and gardens. Its population was a mix of Muslims, Christians, and a small Jewish community. The surrounding plains were fertile, producing wheat and barley for export. But Gaza also suffered. Droughts, locust swarms, and epidemics periodically devastated the land. Poverty was widespread. Many travelers remarked on the city's ruined buildings, relics of its more glorious past. In the mid-19th century, the Ottoman Empire attempted reforms known as the Tanzimat, aiming to modernize administration and centralize power. In Gaza, this meant new taxation systems, conscription for the army, and efforts to improve governance. The Ottomans also worked to integrate Gaza more closely into global trade networks. Telegraph lines, new roads, and modern institutions slowly reached the city. Yet these reforms often created friction. Heavy taxes and forced military service fueled resentment among locals. Gaza remained poor, and modernization did little to ease the burdens of ordinary people. As the 20th century approached, Gaza remained a quiet town of perhaps 40,000 inhabitants, surrounded by fields and orchards. Its days as a regional powerhouse seemed long gone. But Gaza's location, on the border of Sinai, along the road between Africa and Asia, meant it would soon be thrust back into the storm of world events. When the First World War erupted in 1914, the Ottoman Empire allied with Germany against Britain and France. Gaza once again became a battlefield. In 1917, British and Ottoman armies clashed in a series of brutal battles on Gaza's very doorstep. Trenches scarred its fields, artillery thundered across its skies, and thousands of soldiers lay dead on its soil. The outcome of those battles would change Gaza's fate forever. For when the smoke cleared, the Ottomans were gone, and Gaza would fall under British rule. A new chapter was beginning, one that would set the stage for the modern Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The First World War brought the clash of empires directly onto Gaza's soil. Between 1917 and 1918, 3 major battles were fought for control of Gaza between British and Ottoman forces. The First Battle of Gaza ended indecisively. The second battle was a bloody failure for the British. But the Third Battle of Gaza proved decisive. Under the leadership of General Edmund Allenby, British and Anzac troops broke through Ottoman lines, capturing the city and paving the way for the conquest of Jerusalem. The war left Gaza battered. Trenches carved up its fields. Artillery reduced homes to rubble. The civilian population suffered greatly. Yet, when the Ottoman Empire collapsed, Gaza, like the rest of Palestine, passed into new hands, the British Empire. In 1920, the League of Nations awarded Britain the mandate for Palestine. Officially, Britain was to prepare the land for eventual independence. In reality, the mandate allowed Britain to rule the territory directly. For Gaza, British rule brought both modernization and turmoil. On one hand, the British repaired infrastructure, introduced new schools, and built administrative offices. The port of Gaza was modestly improved, and roads linked the city more firmly to the wider region. But British rule also sowed division. The Balfour Declaration of 1917, in which Britain promised support for a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, alarmed the Arab population. Palestinians, Muslims, and Christians alike feared displacement. In Gaza, anti-British and anti-Zionist sentiments ran strong. Protests and strikes erupted throughout the 1920s and 1930s. By the 1930s, tensions across Palestine reached a breaking point. The influx of Jewish immigrants fleeing European persecution, combined with growing land purchases by Zionist organizations, fueled Palestinian anger. In 1936, a massive uprising broke out, known as the Arab Revolt. Gaza was deeply involved. Strikes, demonstrations, and armed resistance targeted both the British authorities and Jewish settlements. The revolt was crushed with brutal force. The British deployed tens of thousands of troops, executed leaders, and demolished homes. Gaza, like much of Palestine, was left scarred and impoverished. Yet the underlying tensions did not disappear. They only deepened, setting the stage for the coming catastrophe. During World War II, Gaza itself saw little fighting. But the war's consequences were enormous. The Holocaust annihilated millions of European Jews, intensifying global support for the establishment of a Jewish homeland. As Jewish immigration to Palestine increased after 1945, Palestinian Arabs feared they would be turned into a minority in their own land. Gaza's people braced for conflict. And in 1947, the world's attention turned to Palestine once more. In November 1947, the United Nations voted to partition Palestine into 2 states, one Jewish, one Arab, with Jerusalem as an international city. For Palestinians, the plan was a disaster. Gaza, densely populated and overwhelmingly Arab, was not included in the proposed Jewish state. But Palestinians rejected partition altogether. They argued it gave away too much land to the Zionists. Civil war erupted between Jews and Arabs in Palestine. Villages were attacked. Refugees fled. The violence spiraled. On May 14, 1948, the State of Israel was declared. The very next day, armies from Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Iraq invaded. The 1948 Arab-Israeli War had begun. Gaza, lying close to the Egyptian border, became a critical battleground. Egyptian forces moved in to occupy the Gaza Strip, using it as a base of operations against Israel. But the war ended in disaster for the Arab side. Israel expanded far beyond the UN partition borders, capturing most of historic Palestine. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians fled or were expelled from their homes, an event they call the Nakba, or catastrophe. Gaza suddenly was transformed. Its pre-war population of around 80,000 exploded as more than 200,000 Palestinian refugees flooded into the Strip. Camps sprang up overnight, tents stretching across the fields. The land was overwhelmed, resources strained to the breaking point. For the first time in history, Gaza was cut off, separated from the rest of Palestine, hemmed in by new borders, and forced to absorb a massive refugee population. After the 1948 war, Gaza came under the administration of Egypt. But unlike the West Bank, which Jordan annexed, Egypt did not annex Gaza. Instead, it governed the Strip under military rule. Life in Gaza during these years was harsh. Refugee camps swelled with families dependent on rations from the newly formed UN Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA. Jobs were scarce, poverty widespread, and opportunities limited. Egypt restricted movement in and out of Gaza, wary of Israeli infiltration and unrest. Yet Gaza also became a center of Palestinian political activity. Resistance groups formed, committed to reclaiming lost lands. Throughout the 1950s, Fedayeen fighters launched raids into Israel from Gaza. In retaliation, Israeli forces struck back with devastating raids, killing civilians and fighters alike. This cycle of attack and reprisal became Gaza's new reality. In 1956, Gaza once again found itself in the middle of a global conflict. After Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, Britain, France, and Israel launched a coordinated invasion of Egypt. Israeli forces swiftly occupied the Gaza Strip. For a few months, Gaza experienced direct Israeli control. The occupation was marked by mass arrests and violence, including the infamous Khan Yunis and Rafah massacres, where hundreds of Palestinians were killed. Under international pressure, however, Israel withdrew in early 1957, and Gaza returned to Egyptian administration. But the episode underscored Gaza's vulnerability. Its people were pawns in larger geopolitical struggles. By the 1960s, Gaza was bursting at the seams. Over 400,000 Palestinians crowded into the tiny strip of land. Refugee camps had become semi-permanent cities of cinder block and tin. Poverty, unemployment, and hopelessness defined daily life. Yet Gaza was also a hotbed of Palestinian nationalism. Leaders like Yasser Arafat and movements like Fatah gained followers among the young and dispossessed. Egypt maintained tight control. But Gaza's people were restless. And in 1967, everything would change once again. In June of that year, a war lasting just 6 days would redraw the map of the Middle East. Israel would capture Gaza and hold it for nearly 4 decades. For Gaza's people, the occupation marked the beginning of a new chapter of resistance, suffering, and global attention. The strip of land once known for ancient trade and empires would now be synonymous with checkpoints, soldiers, and walls. June 1967. In less than a week, the entire Middle East is transformed. As tensions escalated between Israel and its Arab neighbors, War broke out on June 5th. Israel launched preemptive strikes against Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. Within days, Israel captured the Sinai Peninsula, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Golan Heights, and the Gaza Strip. For Gaza, this moment changed everything. The Strip, which had been under Egyptian control for nearly 2 decades, was now under Israeli military occupation. The world was stunned. Gaza's people, most of them refugees from 1948, now lived under the direct control of the very state they had fled from. Israel quickly established a military administration in Gaza. Checkpoints, curfews, and strict controls defined daily life. But Israel also introduced something new: settlements. In the early 1970s, Israeli governments authorized the construction of Jewish settlements inside Gaza, particularly in its most fertile and strategic lands along the coast. By the 1980s, thousands of settlers lived in heavily fortified enclaves, protected by the Israeli army, while Palestinians around them struggled in poverty. Resistance simmered. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, Gaza became a hotbed of Palestinian activism. Armed groups like Fatah, led by Yasser Arafat, carried out guerrilla attacks. Others organized underground schools, unions, and charities to preserve Palestinian identity under occupation. Israel's response was harsh. Raids, arrests, and demolitions became common. Entire neighborhoods were bulldozed as collective punishment for suspected militant activity. The occupation created both despair and defiance. Gaza's young generation, born in refugee camps, grew up knowing nothing but checkpoints and barbed wire. By the mid-1980s, the situation in Gaza was explosive. Overcrowding, unemployment, and hopelessness created a pressure cooker. Then, in December 1987, the spark came. An Israeli military truck collided with a Palestinian car in Gaza's Jabalia refugee camp, killing 4 Palestinians. Rumors spread that the crash was deliberate. Protests erupted. The anger quickly spread beyond Gaza into the West Bank. The First Intifada, or uprising, had begun. The Intifada was unlike anything before. It was not led by armies, but by ordinary people, students, shopkeepers, women. But children. Stones became the symbol of resistance. Young Palestinians clashed with Israeli soldiers daily. Strikes and boycotts crippled the local economy, while underground committees organized schools and healthcare when the Israeli authorities shut them down. The uprising transformed Gaza into the beating heart of Palestinian resistance. Israel responded with force. Soldiers fired live ammunition, imposed curfews, and carried out mass arrests. The world watched as television images of children throwing stones at tanks flooded international screens. The human toll was devastating. By the end of the Intifada, over 1,000 Palestinians and more than 100 Israelis had been killed. The Intifada also gave rise to a new and powerful player: Hamas. Founded in Gaza in 1987 by Sheikh Ahmed Yassin and other members of the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas combined armed struggle with social welfare programs. Unlike the secular PLO, Hamas framed the conflict in religious as well as national terms. Its popularity grew rapidly, fueled by frustration with Israeli occupation and disillusionment with traditional Palestinian leadership. From this point on, Hamas would become inseparable from Gaza's identity. The First Intifada drew unprecedented global attention to the Palestinian cause. International pressure mounted on Israel. Negotiations that had long seemed impossible suddenly gained urgency. The US, the UN, and other world powers pushed for dialogue. And in the early 1990s, hope flickered. In 1993, secret negotiations between Israeli and Palestinian leaders led to the Oslo Accords. For the first time, Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, recognized each other. The agreement promised limited Palestinian self-rule in parts of Gaza and the West Bank. When Yasser Arafat returned to Gaza in 1994 to establish the Palestinian Authority, crowds of thousands cheered. For many, it was the first real glimpse of freedom in decades. But hopes would soon collide with reality. The dream of peace proved fragile. Settlements expanded. Violence flared. Trust eroded. And soon, a second, bloodier uprising would engulf Gaza, plunging it back into war. The cycle of hope and despair, peace talks and bloodshed, would define Gaza's story into the new millennium. When Yasser Arafat returned to Gaza in July 1994, the atmosphere was electric. For the first time in decades, Palestinians had their own governing body, the Palestinian Authority, responsible for civil administration, policing, and some degree of self-rule. The Oslo Accords had promised that Gaza, along with parts of the West Bank, would serve as the foundation of a future Palestinian state. Crowds filled Gaza City to welcome Arafat. Banners waved. Families cheered. Hope was in the air. But beneath the celebration lay deep challenges. Gaza was impoverished, overcrowded, and heavily dependent on international aid. Israel still controlled the Strip's borders, airspace, and sea, and Israeli settlements remained embedded inside Gaza, guarded by soldiers and protected by bypass roads. For many Gazans, Oslo felt less like liberation, and more like partial autonomy under continuing occupation. The Palestinian Authority, or PA, established ministries, police forces, or schools. International donors poured money into Gaza, funding infrastructure and development projects. But corruption and inefficiency plagued the new administration. The PA was accused of favoring elites while ordinary families remained trapped in poverty. Israel continued to impose closures on Gaza whenever security tensions rose. These closures cut off workers from jobs in Israel, strangling the economy. Meanwhile, Hamas, which had rejected the Oslo process, gained popularity by presenting itself as a clean, religious, and uncompromising alternative to the PA. By the mid-1990s, around 8,000 Israeli settlers lived in Gaza, concentrated in fortified enclaves such as Gush Katif. These settlements occupied about 20 of the Strip's land, much of it fertile farmland, while over 1 million Palestinians crowded into the remaining space. Protected by the Israeli army, the settlements became a constant flashpoint. To Palestinians, they were daily reminders that Oslo had failed to deliver true sovereignty. The late 1990s saw rising disillusionment. Negotiations dragged on without meaningful progress. Settlements expanded. Checkpoints multiplied. In 2000, talks between Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak and Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat at Camp David collapsed. Each side blamed the other for failure. Just months later, the fragile peace was shattered. In September 2000, Israeli opposition leader Ariel Sharon visited the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound in Jerusalem, a site sacred to both Muslims and Jews. The move was seen by Palestinians as a provocation. Protests erupted. Israeli security forces responded with force. The Second Intifada, also called the Al-Aqsa Intifada, had begun. Compared to the first, this uprising was far more violent. In Gaza, militant groups carried out shootings, mortar attacks, and suicide bombings. Israel responded with overwhelming military power, airstrikes, invasions, and targeted assassinations. Gaza's streets became battlegrounds. Tanks rolled through neighborhoods. Helicopters fired missiles into crowded camps. Militants fought back with homemade rockets and ambushes. The human cost was staggering. Between 2000 and 2005, thousands of Palestinians and hundreds of Israelis were killed. Gaza bore a disproportionate share of the suffering. For Israel, Gaza became an impossible dilemma. The settlements required enormous military protection, tying down thousands of soldiers. Every attack from militants brought demands for retaliation, fueling an endless cycle of violence. By the early 2000s, even Israeli leaders began to question whether holding on to Gaza was worth the cost. Ironically, it was Ariel Sharon, the same man whose 2000 visit to Al-Aqsa helped trigger the uprising, who would make the most dramatic decision about Gaza's future. As Prime Minister, Sharon announced in 2003 a bold new plan. Israel would unilaterally withdraw from Gaza. The decision shocked the world. Supporters called it pragmatic, a recognition that Gaza's settlements were unsustainable. Critics, including many Israelis, called it a surrender to terrorism. Palestinians, too, were divided. Some celebrated it as a victory of resistance, while others feared it was a move to isolate Gaza while tightening control over the West Bank. In August 2005, Israel carried out the Gaza disengagement plan. In a dramatic operation broadcast live on television, Israeli soldiers entered settlements in Gaza, not to defend them, but to evacuate them. Families were removed, sometimes by force. Synagogues were abandoned. Homes were demolished. Within weeks, all 21 settlements in Gaza were gone. Israeli soldiers withdrew to the borders. For the first time since 1967, Gaza no longer had a permanent Israeli presence inside it. Crowds of Palestinians flooded the vacated areas, waving flags and declaring victory. For many, it was a moment of triumph, proof that resistance had worked where negotiations had failed. But Israel retained control over Gaza's borders, coastline, and airspace. Gaza was technically disengaged, but in reality it remained under tight Israeli control from the outside. The disengagement was supposed to be the start of something new. But instead of peace, Gaza was about to enter its most turbulent era yet. Elections, civil war, a siege, and a series of wars that would devastate the Strip again and again. The next chapter would define Gaza's modern identity and make it one of the most contested, blockaded, and bombarded places on Earth. When Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005, the question immediately arose: who would govern the Strip? The Palestinian Authority, PA, led by Mahmoud Abbas after Yasser Arafat's death in 2004, was officially in charge. But in the streets of Gaza, another force had grown too powerful to ignore: Hamas. In 2006, Palestinians across Gaza and the West Bank went to the polls. The world expected Fatah, the dominant faction of the PA, to win easily. But the results shocked everyone. Hamas won a majority in the Palestinian Legislative Council, sweeping Gaza in particular. For many voters, it wasn't about ideology. It was about frustration. Fatah was seen as corrupt, ineffective, and compromised. Hamas, by contrast, had built a reputation for disciplined social services and unyielding resistance against Israel. The victory gave Hamas democratic legitimacy, but it also set off a political earthquake. The United States, Israel, and the European Union refused to recognize a Hamas-led government, labeling the group a terrorist organization. Aid was suspended. Sanctions were imposed. Pressure mounted on Mahmoud Abbas to sideline Hamas. The result was paralysis. Palestinians were left with two governments that could not or would not work together. By 2007, tensions between Fatah and Hamas exploded into open conflict. In Gaza, street battles raged. Neighborhoods turned into war zones as militants loyal to each faction fought for control. Within days, Hamas seized power, driving Fatah forces out of Gaza. The Palestinian leadership was split in two. Hamas ruled Gaza, while Fatah retained control of the West Bank. This division has never been fully healed. After Hamas takeover, Israel and Egypt imposed a blockade on Gaza. Borders were sealed. Imports and exports restricted. The movement of people tightly controlled. Israel argued the blockade was necessary to prevent weapons smuggling to Hamas. Critics called it collective punishment of Gaza's 2 million residents. Life inside Gaza grew harsher than ever. Fuel shortages led to blackouts. Factories closed. Unemployment soared. Ordinary families were trapped in what many described as an open-air prison. Tensions boiled over in December 2008. After years of rocket fire from Gaza into southern Israel and Israeli raids in return, the conflict escalated into full-scale war. Israel launched Operation Cast Lead, a 3-week offensive against Hamas. Airstrikes, artillery, and ground forces pounded Gaza. Hamas and other militant groups fired thousands of rockets into Israel. By the time the war ended in January 2009, more than 1,000 Palestinians and 13 Israelis had been killed. Much of Gaza's infrastructure lay in ruins, schools, police stations, even UN shelters. The war drew international outrage. Israel was accused of disproportionate force. Hamas was condemned for targeting civilians. Gaza's people paid the heaviest price. With the blockade tightening, Gaza's economy adapted in desperate ways. Along the border with Egypt, thousands of smuggling tunnels were dug. Through these tunnels flowed everything: fuel, food, construction materials, and weapons. The tunnels became a lifeline for ordinary Gazans, but also a strategic asset for Hamas. Israel and Egypt worked relentlessly to destroy them, leading to deadly collapses and bombings. Gaza's survival was now literally underground. In November 2012, conflict flared again. After Israel assassinated Ahmed Jabari, a top Hamas military commander, Hamas responded with waves of rocket fire. For the first time, rockets reached as far as Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. Israel launched Operation Pillar of Defense, an 8-day campaign of airstrikes. Around 170 Palestinians and 6 Israelis were killed before an Egyptian-brokered ceasefire ended the fighting. The war underscored Hamas' growing military